Choosing to go with the Britney Spears microphone tonight, so hopefully this frees up my hands for a little bit of animation. My name is Jelle Pol. I'm the business lead for Dusk Network. We're here tonight, actually quite well represented. We have a few people over from the Netherlands and just flew in from London from previous events. And I'm going to take roughly 20 to 25 minutes to explain a little bit about what it is we're building with Dusk Network and how we plan to make an impact in the space, right? So Dusk Network is a new blockchain. It's a protocol, so it's not a fork, it's not built on top of anything else. It's its own blockchain, and it focuses on privacy, and more importantly, what we call flexible privacy. When we look at the space, especially the state of privacy in DLT, we see that it's treated quite binary, right? So a ledger is either fully open or fully closed. When you look at fully closed ledgers, they're tricky because they often come across as a little bit shady, regulator unfriendly, these type of allegations, right? And when you look at a fully open ledger, they have their own type of issues. So the fact that everything is transparent doesn't actually mean that regulators are that happy about it. And I'll touch upon this a little bit more later. The goal of Dusk Network in this privacy space is to introduce a spectrum, so hence flexible privacy. So we see all types of use cases that don't really match either full openness or full closeness, but are actually somewhere in the middle, right? And this is different for any type of use case, and we want to create a protocol that can match this kind of real-world need rather than what is convenient to build at this point in time in blockchain. So the goal is really to take away the middleman from regulated markets without actually losing regulatory compliance. And we're focusing on a few key use cases. So the first one is payments. And there you can kind of see Dusk as a faster, more regulator-friendly version of Monero, for example. Another one is communications. Well, in communications, I guess the need for privacy is conceptually easy to understand. We have a strong communications layer in Dusk Network around for video conferencing, audio conferencing, data streaming, you name it. But the big one is really digital assets, and then more specifically security tokens. And the security token angle is what I'll be focusing on kind of the next 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll take you through some of those tech angles as well. So security tokens have been kind of a big buzzword this year, right? 2018, everyone's talking about security tokens, STOs, you name it, but I still haven't participated in an STO or owned a security token, and it wasn't really the year of the security token the way it was advertised. Now why is this? Well, the problem is that current STO solutions are going to ignore privacy requirements, and there's two kind of big ones. The first one is trade secrecy. So when you look at a regulated market and you're a fund, for example, with all kinds of equity positions, then you don't want your competitors to be able to see this on an open ledger, right? And the second one is market manipulation, and this is probably the most important one. So many of you are on Reddit, they're on all types of news sites, and you see what happens when an anti-Cox wallet is touched or a Silver wallet is touched, and there's a big movement of Bitcoin, and everybody panics, and the price crashes. And there's this kind of cascading effect down. Now in the regulated market, this is often seen as manipulation and, well, at the very least frowned upon and often illegal. So when we look at the blockchain space and the security token space on a fully open ledger, this is something we have to avoid. Because if I'm a big fund with, I don't know, $5 million into security, and I want to exit my position and move it to an exchange, and that causes me to destroy all my own value because people start dumping, and I'm not only impacting my own profit, but I'm also harming this company unnecessarily. So this is where privacy, especially in secondary markets, is much more important than we realize. What we also see is that other propositions resort to all types of kind of off-chain middlemen. So off-chain custodians or off-chain capital institutions, and this kind of reintroduces middlemen into the equation, making solutions very centralized, not really offering the benefits that we all came to know blockchain for. This also prevents scalability because I have to send you something and I press on the button on my side and then I have to wait for someone else to say yes. Then what is the point, right? What have we improved? And the final point, and this is of course also part of the immaturity of the space, is that a lot of these SDO platforms, they vastly overcharge and they don't really deliver that much. So what's the opportunity here, right? So what are we trying to do with Dusk? So first of all, it's a protocol, right? And the whole regulatory framework is captured on-chain. This doesn't only make it cheaper or allow anyone to build on top of it that's savvy enough, it also makes it vastly more scalable and decentralized. This means, for example, that there's potential for decentralized exchange because of the fact that everything is captured on-chain. And it's confidential and compliant. So this privacy spectrum that is different for any types of use cases needs to be met, and it's not just that regulators want transparency, and regulators also want confidentiality, and by ignoring one of these, you're basically, well, you're at least not setting yourself up for mass adoption. So how does this roughly work? So we have a tech stack at Dusk that consists roughly of 3 layers, and I'll quickly go through them. What I want to mention here that I think is most important is the fact that we're creating a standard. So if you're going for adoption, there needs to be some standardization, right? So you all know the ERC20 standard, what it did for ICOs, that's Ethereum, and we're creating the XSD standard, confidential security token, what will be for STOs on top of Dusk. The first kind of layer in the network, and I'll only spend a few seconds here, is a gossip layer. So it's inspired by ITP's garlic routing, which was in turn inspired by onion routing made famous by Tor network. But the main thing, the main reason why a gossip network is a strong thing to have is because it prevents things like statistical analysis that de-anonymize kind of the players in the network. And this is important when we move to consensus. So at Dusk Network, we've created our own consensus mechanism. It's called segregated Byzantine agreement. And it moves away from consensus mechanisms like proof of work or proof of stake. You can classify it as a PDFT consensus mechanism. But it does a few things differently because it's focused on privacy, right? So the first thing is it uses a process called sortition. This is basically a lottery that is run to decide who gets to propose a block, right? So there's block proposers, and they gossip kind of the score they obtain from this lottery, and when it is proven that they obtain the highest score, they get to propose a block. They propose this block to the second type of node in the network. We call this a provisioner, and provisioners don't transact. So it's only this first type of node that's transactional, and the second type of node is non-transactional. And the reason for this is because that allows it to focus on taking care of intensive stuff, like verification, voting, notarization, what we call VVN operations. So the first round is verification, right? So this is just a check, okay, did you propagate the correct score? Are you a legitimate player? Does this block look like it's in reasonable shape, okay? We pass it on to the voters. And then the voters will then vote in a few rounds on the proposed block or a default empty block. They'll reach consensus here, pass it on to the notaries, and the notaries add it to the blockchain, make sure all the reward info is captured, and the original proposer of the block gets the block reward, and the cycle continues. Now, one of the big things here is that it reaches direct finality. So this means no unintended forks or any kind of nastiness of that sort. The third layer is something we call secure tunnel switching. This touches much more upon the communications layer in Dusk Network. So secure tunnel switching is inspired basically by the payphone. The payphone was a wonderful invention that did a great many things. But when we look at its application in crypto, it allows us to tackle streaming. Streaming was quite difficult previously. You used clunky solutions like escrows because you're on blockchain, right? You're working with blocks. What we have created is very similar to this payphone mechanism that I just described. So if I want to communicate to Bob on the other side, I insert a token, for example, a Dusk coin into the secure tunnel switching methodology, and a circuit is opened. The circuit runs through nodes in the network who kind of relay the signal until I start reaching bottom. We open communications and we can start streaming. Now, what happens as my kind of time runs out for the one token I put in a second token, and through a new kind of circuit of nodes, I start aiming for Bob again, right? Bob starts to receive the second data stream, and he performs basically a synchronization operation. And as soon as the two data streams are matched, the original tunnel is dropped, we continue the second tunnel, and this process repeats. So this means that, for example, a data stream is only running through a certain circuit for 30 seconds or a minute. It runs through many different nodes, which makes it very, very robust against all types of attacks, against all attempts at kind of data or information interception. So, how do we enable privacy in all of this, right? So, I already mentioned gossiping the result of dissertation. That's already an area in the consensus where we use things like bulletproof, but especially in direct transactions, it becomes more relevant. So there's all types of information available about senders and recipients in a transaction, and the actual amount in a transaction, and there's kind of different things you can do to enable privacy. So when you're talking about senders, you can use bulletproof as well, or things like a ring signature. And when you're talking about recipients, you can use the stealth address, but it's when you start looking at information such as the amount of the transaction, where you need to start doing a few things that are a little bit more clever. So the amount of the transaction, for example, is something that we want to keep confidential. Like I said, market manipulation, confidentiality is important, but we then need to prove certain things, right? So, for example, a transaction cannot contain a negative amount, or it cannot attempt a double spend. These are all the kind of traditional problems we need to solve. And for this, we use something called a range proof, and this is part of bulletproof. So a range proof basically says it has to be positive, or kind of other types of parameters that kind of ensure that the players are playing according to the rules you want them to play to. So if I send someone 5 Dusk, then my account should be depleted by 5. So if I should not be able to send someone -5 Dusk, because that would mean my kind of wallet goes up by 5. And there's all kind of bad things you can do here, such as depleting other wallets, depleting the Coinbase, or kind of making stuff up out of thin air. And this is the kind of stuff you really want to avoid at all costs. And there's a few other areas where we can use bulletproof. So you can use bulletproof to kind of prove any type of algebraic statement. You can use it to kind of prove eligibility. So for example, the example we had earlier, I am older than 18 without disclosing my actual age information. And some of the other interesting stuff we can do here is basically create a kind of zero knowledge whitelist. So when we're talking about these different types of parameters that we can start proving in zero knowledge without actually disclosing information, that's when we start heading into the compliancy space. So in the example of the security token, there's a few things very, very important in order to be compliant, and the main one is KYC AML. So you're all familiar with the term, but there's a few challenges here. So KYC cannot really be decentralized. So there's no way a government one of whose kind of biggest responsibilities is to prevent money laundering is going to delegate something like that to a decentralized solution. And anyone who's claiming otherwise, at least as far as I know, is either confusing KYC AML with identity management or is lying. But there are other things you can do. So when we talk to the regulators, what we find out is that they do not really care about who is transacting with who and what amounts. They care about that all of these players have gone through kind of pre-approved process. So they are very, very considerate about KYC AML. But once a person has passed that and has been approved, they're quite happy about things. They're quite happy for these people to go off and transact to others, as long as all of the players in the game have gone through this kind of pre-approval process. So then this KYC becomes something that we can decouple from an otherwise decentralized system, right? And we can start capturing these type of things in zero knowledge. So if a third party is issuing equity, for example, in a security token, through a security token offering, they can choose their own KYC provider, whatever they're comfortable with, and as soon as they start getting people that have been approved, then we can give them the possibility to add these people to this zero knowledge whitelist I described. And they then obtain something called a witness, and this witness is basically what you then start using to transact. So we don't know who's in the game, and the game now being trading a certain security token, but we know they've all passed KYC AML, and we know they're all allowed to trade together, and we can prove this using bulletproof, using these witnesses I just mentioned. And this allows us to enforce something called token trade restrictions, and this is basically nothing more than I am allowed to trade with you, or you're allowed to trade with me, and we cannot trade with people that haven't got this witness, that haven't joined this zero knowledge whitelist. Now this is very important because we can now embed this on the protocol level. It becomes very, very scalable. So after I've gone through this process that is now decoupled, it's encoded on the token level, right? So I don't have to resolve the off-chain solutions, the middlemen, the centralized stuff. It can scale up as far as the kind of solution that is built on top of a decentralized exchange or a centralized exchange or another application of the protocol. And this is quite relevant. However, there's always a small catch, right? So why hasn't anyone done this yet? So the problem with KYC AML is that it has to be refreshed occasionally. So you cannot just join and say, well, I passed KYC AML 20 years ago and I've since turned to a life of crime and now everything is still great. No, this needs to be refreshed, and the way this can be done is by creating zero knowledge smart contracts at the very, very beginning that are flexible enough to kind of adapt, but that allow you to, for example, force exclusion out of a whitelist. So that it basically means that people need to update, refresh their KYC status without reintroducing a middleman. Because if you centralize that again, then what is the point, right? So bringing that back a little bit to the use cases again, now that we've talked a little bit about some of the technical stuff we use. Secure and confidential payments. So you're familiar with cross-border payment use case of Bitcoin, but you can now do this whilst always being fully compliant and at higher speed. And with communications, it is again the same concept, but especially in the security token space. We've created a protocol that is scalable, that is cheap, that has a standard that anyone can kind of use to build on top of, if they're savvy enough technically and legally. And that, for example, has the possibility to create a DEX on top of. So, how are we bringing this to market, right? So, it's a protocol, and a protocol kind of lives or dies by the amount of cool stuff that is built on top, basically. So on the tech side, I won't spend too much time, so the reason I included this is because sometimes people feel that the use cases are fragmented, and when you look at it technically, foundationally, this is kind of quite far from the truth. And when you talk about payments, that's a kind of transaction into one direction, right? A sends something to B. And when you start talking digital assets, that's bi-directional. So we trade something. And then we get into communications, and then we start talking about streaming. So it's a bi-directional transaction, but we don't know the time yet. And this is kind of a very logical, technical roadmap, when you think in terms of complexity, that happens to fit three use cases with very big markets, that also very strongly benefit from confidentiality and compliance. So what about the business side? So Dusk Foundation, that's the body governing the development and the adoption of the Dusk Network, is part of a European consortium, and we're actively this regulation, this adoption of things like zero knowledge for regulatory compliance, and we're making quite good headway. And one of the things we've done is create an STO incubator, which can help bring companies that either want to emit equity or want to otherwise tokenize a security like a fund or another project to come build on top of Dusk at a fraction of the cost and with an additional legion of kind of technical benefits. And we have well, the first kind of class of STOs committed for our incubator. So when Dusk Network is live early next year, it won't just be for show, right? You'll kick off right away with a very good number of STOs, and the reason these guys are kind of starting to come to us is because they don't see the requirements met in the existing solutions. So the solution might have built something that works technically, as I mentioned, that's kind of convenient, but it doesn't solve their pain, because their pain is about confidentiality, about compliance, and it has to work in the real world. So it might be a little bit more tricky to build, but there's a much bigger prize at the end of it, and I guess that's kind of always true. So, just a few points in summary, and then I'll spend a few minutes on things like the team, because I have a little bit of extra time, and I think it's worth mentioning. So, Dusk is a privacy protocol, right? It's its own blockchain, and you can build whatever you want on top of it, but if there's a need for confidentiality, for compliance, and for scalability, then Dusk might be a good choice. We have a solid idea of how to take this to market, and like I mentioned, the STO incubator has real demand, real world demand. The last point is about the fact that we're wrapping up our race, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So talking about the team, the slide is incomplete, it becomes outdated basically every time we update it. So I'm Jelle Pol, I'm at the bottom there. Other people we have on board that are with us is, for example, Emanuela, our tech lead, and Dimitri, for example, is our lead cryptographer. Dimitri, we're talking about, he's the guy that invented Accryhash. The hashing algorithm used in Zcash. We have Kev with us. He joined us from NEO, so we have a few developers from NEO Research, the city of Zion. We have guys from Mozilla. It's becoming a very strong team that knows how to practice. On the advisory side, and I won't go through all of them, but I think you'll appreciate the kind of the overview of people that is kind of not just there to look pretty, but that's relevant, right? So we have guys like Gary, for example, who has extensive experience not only in the IPO space, but also in the telco space and in the payment space. And the same goes for Marcel. He's the former founder of BitPay, which does a lot of payment integration and adoption for Bitcoin. And we're going to be leveraging, obviously, all of that know-how for the adoption of Dusk. So I'd like to talk for a few more seconds here. So one of the exciting things about Dusk is that we've kind of been behind the scenes for roughly a year. And since I think the last 4 to 6 weeks, we've slowly begun public. And last Tuesday we were in London to announce our partnership with iFinex, so the mother company behind eTfinex and Bitfinex. They're going to be listing us in December. But the interesting part here is that our sales are largely been private, right? Because we need the right partners on board. But what we've done is to create some kind of publicly facing part of our sales, and the eTfinex is now hosting us as their first kind of token sale. And I think the official announcement is either tonight or tomorrow, and then we will be the very first project to feature on eTfinex. Where anyone can contribute, obviously provided they pass KYC AML, and then it's onwards until December when Dusk as a protocol becomes liquid, and then the next stop, mainnet. So hopefully I was able to explain a little bit about why privacy and transparency are both forces of good, that it's about how you use them, and the importance of solving all of this on-chain, because otherwise you start throwing all the kind of benefits of blockchain and decentralization out of the window, yeah, you just start bringing money to traditional companies again. So if you haven't heard of us now, or if you haven't heard of us yet, I hope you keep an eye on us from now on. And thank you very much for your time.